Welcome back to the porch, everyone. It's another beautiful day here in Tallahassee, Florida, and we certainly hope it is wherever you are tuning in from. The sun is shining today, and John and I are out on the porch doing what we do best, and that is, of course, drinking whiskey.
Pour a little whiskey.
But today's fun because we're not drinking bourbon today. We're actually stepping a little bit out of our wheelhouse, and we're actually drinking Canadian whiskey today, which is pretty exciting. And admittedly, I don't know a lot about Canadian whiskey. I've tried quite a bit of Canadian whiskey, and I've enjoyed it, but that's kind of the extent of my knowledge. John, you probably know a little bit more than I do.
only that I've been drinking a few years longer than you have. That's it.
Well, John, we're lucky today because we're not only going to drink Canadian whiskey, but we're going to learn about it. And I think we have the perfect person to teach us about Canadian whiskey because I would venture to say our guest today is probably one of the foremost experts on Canadian whiskey in the world.
Right.
He is the master blender for the Hiram Walker Sons Distillery in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. He's a published author. He is the inventor of the Canadian whiskey wheel, and he is also a whiskey doctor. And that's not something you hear very often. And we're going to learn a little more about what that means and what his specialty is in that regard. But we are thrilled to be joined today by the one and only Dr. Don Livermore. Dr. Don, great to be with you.
Hey, gentlemen, how are you guys today?
Great, thank you.
Oh, we're great. How's the weather up there in Windsor?
Oh, it is cold. We had snow over the weekend, but it's welcome. It's part of what Canadian whiskey is all about. We do rely on the seasonal changes when we age our whiskey. So we want that warm, sultry, humid summers right around the Great Lakes where we're located, and certainly the cold winters. And that came this week here. So it's just another whiskey season, I suppose.
Well, we hate the cold weather, but we certainly love what it does to your whiskey, and so we won't complain.
I want to use that. It's just another whiskey season. That's what they are, aren't they?
That's right. Well, so Dr. Don, we got a lot to talk to you about today, but we want to start a little bit and just talk about you before we get into this delicious whiskey we have today, because as I mentioned, there's a lot about you that I think is very special and that is very unique, that master distillers and master blenders around the world do not have credentials like you have, that play a very important part in what you do and some of the things that I think you pioneered. So just to begin, tell us a little bit about how you started this whole journey and ended up where you are and ultimately a doctor in whiskey.
Yeah, so I've been in the whiskey industry since 1996. I pretty much landed at a distillery right from university, where my first degree was in microbiology. So I was hired to look after yeast cells and the brewing side of distillation. We are brewers first. So I worked in the laboratory for many years, and I've developed many techniques along the way that are now industry normals, and using infrared sensors and things like that. But I'm a sucker for education, so I pursued a Master's of Science in Brewing and Distilling at Heriot-Watt University while I worked at the Hiram Walker Distillery. I completed that in 2002. And then shortly thereafter, I started a PhD in brewing and distilling at Heriot-Watt, which is in Edinburgh, Scotland. So I'm one of very few master blenders or distillers in the world that has a PhD in brewing and distilling. And along the way, I've been promoted to various departments in the distillation area and ultimately into the blending area, and then research and development. So as a master blender, it's a glorified word, is research and development, but I'm the guy that develops recipes for making Canadian whiskey.
So master blender, do they use a master distiller title in Canada at all?
They could. At our distillery, we don't have that term technically, but I work closely with our distiller every day on learning how or making new types of distillates. So with Canadian whiskey, we're the opposite of bourbon. So meaning that we're not held to making a mash bill. We can if we want. For Canadian whiskey, all we have to do is be made of grain, fermented, aged, and distilled in Canada, aged in a wooden barrel of less than 700 liters for a minimum of 3 years and a minimum of 40% alcohol. That's it. There's only one definition of whiskey in Canada. We don't have multiple categories. It then becomes to the master blender on what types and styles of whiskey you want to make. For bourbon, they tend to call them master distillers because really you're just kind of playing with mash bills, maybe a little bit of things around barrels, but for the most part, it's about that distillation around that mash bill. Whereas we take it a step further, and we can look at all aspects of our operation. And we as larger distillers like the Hiram Walker Distillery, through the years, we started with a mash bill. If you go back in the early 1800s, then we kind of evolved through the years. And the larger distillers tend to separate the grains and ferment rye separately, and barley separately, and wheat separately, distill it separately, age it separately, and then put it together at the end. That's why we call them master blenders in Canada. It's kind of like that conductor of an orchestra. So I might want to look at different percentages of grains in the recipes, or different barrel types in the recipes, or different distillation methods, and that's where that one catch-all definition of Canadian whiskey falls in line.
That's very interesting. That's more than I knew. And in 2 minutes, you just quadrupled my knowledge, which is, I find a lot of that very interesting, particularly how you're distilling the grains separately, which, as you pointed out, in bourbon, that's not how we do it. And I mean, what's the rationale behind distilling each grain individually?
I actually think it evolved. We don't have to. The smaller distillers will probably make a mash bill similar to bourbon, but I think where it gets to is product innovation, right? We don't know what you want to drink in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. And I think what it allows for Canadian whiskey to do is be able to innovate and adapt. So if we're carrying larger inventories of wheat, or carrying larger inventories of rye or corn, we can then adapt the proportions or recipes along the way to certain drinkers. I'm old. I grew up on a meat and potato diet. So largely back in the 1970s, 1980s, we had lighter corn style whiskeys, but we can now see an evolution of drinkers today moving towards more rye forward whiskeys. You guys probably know the popularity of rye whiskeys as they are today. In Hiram Walker's 160-year history, we distilled more rye whiskey last year than the entire history. So that allows, I think, by separating the grades, allows us to adapt. Once you make a mash bill, you're kind of done. Right?
Sure.
You can't do a whole hell of a lot afterwards, but if you can keep it separate to the very end of the recipe, we can tweak and do things along the way. And I think that's the rationale why the larger and successful distilleries have set up making the recipe style or blending style of whiskeys.
Interesting.
It would seem to me that you can, let's say you're distilling rye, and you may be distilling rye with your grain from various parts of the country or countries. And,
absolutely true. Absolutely true.
So you can compare the different rye blends and decide on that when you're blending it with whatever.
Yep, there are certain varieties we do look for that have a spicier characteristic. So one of the things with rye and why people like it is rye is a grain that has a high lignin content. I know that's a big word, but lignin is the cement that kind of ties the husk of the grain rye together. And rye is a grain that has that high lignin content. So when we cook and distill, what you're doing is busting apart those lignin molecules, and those are the spicy flavors like eugenol, creosol. There's phenols, 4-ethylglycol. There's a bunch of spicy characters that are very distinctive in rye, and that's what we're targeting for into the distillation. Okay, so when you talked about various hybrids, and that's very true, we've switched to, we're going to have some Lot 40 in a bit, I'm sure here, but we've switched Lot 40's grain into a very specific hybrid called Brasetto rye in the last number of years. And what we've found, it's a spicier rye. It's far more consistent than normal grade 2 rye that you'd purchase as a commodity off the shelf. So it's a movement that we're seeing. Do consumers get it at this point? I think the advanced consumer does, maybe not the introductory rye whiskey drinker, but these are the things that I think about to make our products consistent, spicier and bolder, because we do know that's what the whiskey connoisseurs are looking for today.
So Dr. Don, going back to something you mentioned, that Hiram Walker being a larger distillery, what type of output do you have each year in terms of distillate?
So in a year, we'll distill almost 50 million absolute liters of alcohol. So yeah, that's a fair size. And when I say absolute liters, so you kind of got to divide it by 4. So that gives you that you're getting about 15 to 20 million gallons of whiskey a year. So we are the largest distillery in Canada, if not one of the largest distilleries in North America. I know we kind of say who's larger, but that depends how you count. Distilling large, barrels large, case goods large, but certainly one of the larger ones. But that doesn't negate the fact that there are craftsmen or craftspeople here at our distillery. I mean, we do large runs of Wiser's, which is our main brand here in Canada. But we also do small craft style of whiskeys like the Pike Creek or the Lot 40 that we're talking about. So I often will get writers coming through our distilleries. They said, this is one of the most incredible distilleries we've seen in the world, because we've never really seen somebody or a distillery that can do the multifacets that you can do. Like you can just distill wheat on your own and ferment wheat on your own, or rye or barley, and you could put it in a small pot still, or you could put it in a large column still. I mean, you can hand fill barrels all the way to, the industrial line, and it's a distillery that's set up to be able to handle both. And we do realize that the whiskey community is getting smaller and craftier, and these are the things that I'm working on as a Canadian whiskey producer, is trying new things, new grains, new barrels. I mean, we're constantly trying to steer the ship and showcase what good things can come out of Canada.
What do you mean when you say getting smaller and craftier?
People are looking. I'm getting single barrel release. I swear I get it on a weekly basis. Can I have a single barrel of this as a specialty? I know liquor stores are doing it in the US, yeah. and I kind of, so we're kind of entertaining the thought, but we're doing it in this regard. Is we're not distillers like bourbon. We are blenders, and I keep coming back to when I get these requests to people. I said, we're blenders. We don't do small single barrel releases of things. So what we've done is, in the last 2 seasons, we've worked with some US partners, and it's called the JP Wiser's Signature Series, where we actually do small blends with people and release in their liquor stores. The first year we've had maybe 5 or 6 producers, because it was the first year, and they came and visited me at the distillery. If you have Google Dr. Don Livermore, look me up on Instagram or Twitter, and you'll see I'll line up 140 different whiskeys we make here. You can come here and you blend your own whiskey with me. Wow. And that's what they've done, is that they've chosen this barrel type or this distillation type or this age of whiskey, and they launched it in their liquor stores. So the second season we did that with a group. It was about a dozen that we did it with, and this year we had over 50 requests. Wow. It's crazy the small craft, or the smaller, they're looking for small blends now, not just small barrel picks. They're looking for small blends. So it becomes challenging on our part, is, okay, how do we put this together? How do we filter it? How do we get in a bottle? How do we ultimately deliver to the customer? But the feeling now is that blending is beautiful, because you can start picking the taste that you're really looking for and dialing in the taste notes that the certain regions around the US or Canada are looking for.
And I'm beginning to see that here in the States, in that a number of these barrel pickers, and we're barrel pickers ourselves here at the local liquor store here in Tallahassee. And we started not by accident several years back at Buffalo Trace, of picking 15 barrels, and we'd do single barrels on a number, but then we would take a few and come up with that micro batch. And it was highly unusual 6 years ago. But now we're beginning to see that pop up at other liquor stores and around where they're doing micro batches, but we're not that far along in how we do it, because typically we say, okay, we'll take those 6 and mix them together. We're not, that's hard to call that blending. It's more like dumping.
Oh,
but I think the idea of having someone with blending capabilities, known capabilities, such as yourself, or whoever you have there at the distillery working with the customer on those blends, you got to be coming up with some pretty good, amazing stuff.
Oh yeah, it's that, like I said, it is just exponential that we're going to have to cut off, and how many people are going to do this every year.
Yeah.
But it is a great experience if you can come here, and when you do things individually, you can see what one change makes, and that's what these guys. I mean, they'd want to spend a week with me, and I actually work with them actually, and they'd want to spend a week with me trying to every different nuance and combination, and it really becomes then. You get to walk a mile in my shoes, because then you start, well, what's this consumer looking? Because I can make whiskey taste any which way you want possible, but then you have to then start reading the audience and what consumers are looking for. And I think that's the most important skill a master blender needs to learn, is be able to listen to your consumer. Yeah. What are you looking for in whiskeys? What's new? What's something somebody has tried that you like, or what is something you want to see? We've just released Lot 40. We don't have it here today, but in Canada, that I've aged in a peated quarter cask. I've been being asked for years from these consumers I've been talking with that, what would you like to see with Lot 40? Well, we like the spiciness of rye, but what would it be like in the combination of a peated smoky whiskey? So we went and actively found some used peated quarter casks. We aged Lot 40 in those barrels, and the comments I've received over the past 2 weeks on the brand has been incredible. The feedback, they said, this is what we've been looking for. This is new. This is novel. So listening to your consumer is such an important skill set that a blender needs to have. And then that's where it comes to the Canadian whiskey, where we can adapt. If I keep listening to where I think people are going, then we can deliver the products they're looking for.
Well, speaking of those products, we happen to have a few with us. So
okay.
I was just tasting the rye.
Yeah.
Is it
so why don't we
Lot
dive
40?
into these and learn about what we're drinking. So Dr. Don, where do you think we should start today?
Yeah, we could start with the Lot 40 since you picked it up. It's doesn't matter to me which way we go.
So the Lot 40 rye whiskey.
Yeah, it's a absolutely one of a kind Canadian whiskey. So Lot 40 started out in 1998 with my predecessor, Michael Booth, who was the master blender at that time. He released Lot 40 as a rye whiskey. Typically with rye, as Canadians up until about 1998, we would blend it into something. We would have, it's our flavoring ingredient. In other words, it's the analogy I like to give. It's almost like a single malt is to a blended Scotch, right? So this is where we fermented the rye, distill it through a column still to what your audience is looking for. And we do one extra step. So we make the white dog, as you refer to it. We call it high wines in Canada. Comes off that column still around 70% ABV, 140 proof. We then further put into a classic pot still. Mm-hmm. So what pot stills will do, it's the most simple form of distillation. You slowly distill it. And if you ever have a chance to sit in a master class with me, what I often show on a slide is all the molecules that either come from grains or from yeast. And what pot stills do is separate based on boiling point. So when you slowly boil it, what comes off first is the heads, as your audience would be well aware of, but heads has a real distinctive green grass, herbal note to it. Mm-hmm. We actually cut it, remove it, throw it away. We further distill it, and it actually comes out in this order. If you have a chance to spend a day with me, I do a distillation with you. The fruity flavors comes next, like cherry, pear, and then you get into pineapple and things like that. And then the floral notes come out, lilac notes, and then the spicy rye characters come out. After 12 hours of boiling in our pot still, we stop the distillation and cut it, and you throw it away. The tail smells very, very soapy. So if you ever had some single malt scotches that have that soapiness to it, makes me wonder how long they let the pot stills go on for.
Interesting.
In bourbon, they're all mixed together because you can't do those cuts like that. But with Lot 40, it's different than a lot of the rye whiskeys you get in the US category. Is we remove the heads, the green gas character, remove the tails, the soapy character. So then concentrates up the fruity, floral, and the grain flavor. So when you do that method distillation, you actually sharpen up your rye and make it even more concentrated. What drives me nuts as a blender is how much rye is in your whiskey. And I understand that question when you talk to a bourbon producer, but when you talk to a Canadian whiskey producer, the question you're asking me is not how much rye is in your whiskey, is how much 4-ethyl glycol.
How much what?
How much 4-ethyl glycol.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. But that's the spicy note that 4-ethyl glycol, it's called. That's the spicy note that rye whiskey drinkers are looking for. So that added pot still concentrates it up, and that's what makes Lot 40 different than most straight rye whiskeys you would compare it against in the U.S. category. We further then, just like a U.S. bourbon, we age it in brand new virgin oak barrels, and this is what makes this whiskey very exceptional. So to me, I get very floral notes on it.
So these are in new barrels, you said.
Brand new virgin oak, American oak barrels, yes. We're only 6 hours from Kentucky, so that's where we source a lot of our new white oak from.
Okay.
And yeah, and this is just nicely balanced with that vanilla caramel toffee notes you get out of a brand new barrel. Actually, I use a number 2 char. That's what I did my PhD in. Actually, number 2 barrels give you more vanilla caramel toffee than a number 4 barrel. So that really high rye note, I want to be able to balance with those nice vanilla notes that's coming off the white oak cask.
So what does the number 4 barrel give you more of?
It gives you more of that char, a thicker layer of char on it. And the reason why bourbon, why you'd want that, during the distillation process, the copper salts out sulfur. Yeast makes a lot of sulfur during the fermentation process. And like you said, it doesn't sound good. Sulfur smells like that garlicky, rotten egg, sometimes a burnt match note. And we need to have a lot of copper contact time during the distillation process in order to remove that. So if you don't have enough copper contact time, which depends how fast you run your column stills, the only other way to pull out sulfur is the black layer of the char on the barrel. So many producers will, okay, we know vanilla caramel toffee is going to be higher in our number 2, but it's more important for us to pull out that sulfur note. So we're going to get a thicker layer of char to be able to pull out that sulfur note to make our whiskey better rounded. So that's a mindset of a blender here. Is your spirit very sulfury in nature? You might want to go over to a number 4 barrel.
Wow.
Sorry, I really got off topic there.
No, you really are. It's just
Cheers.
Mesmerizing. This is very nice rye. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, hearing you talk about making the cuts, really set the stage for me in tasting this, because, I don't get those floral grassy type notes that we often see in a lot of younger ryes produced in the US. And I definitely know what you're talking about on the tails with that soapy type note, because I've experienced that as well. When I nose this, I get that rye character, but it's heavy vanilla, toffee, little cherry, and even a little bit of mint. So I definitely do get a floral character there, but not those typical aromas that I find with younger ryes or, craft ryes. Not that there's some people like that, and that's fine, but that's not at all what I get here. I get a very well balanced aroma.
It's not surprising, the comments. I'll often get that at whiskey festivals when I around the world. So this is very different, and I think a lot of the notes you're talking about is probably the tailsy character. I mean, there's more than soapiness. There's other things as well, but my suspicion along the way is probably that tailsy character, and that's why that added pot still really makes this rye whiskey very unique in nature in that regard. Great for cocktails if you like cocktailing. I did talk about a little bit about flavors and things like that, but this might be relevant here. So this is a flavor wheel. I got asked to make a flavor wheel by the Liquor Control Board of Ontario. So we're a controlled state or a controlled province in Ontario, and they're the largest purchaser of our products. And they said, Dr. Don, can you make a whiskey wheel? So I looked at the whiskey wheels out there, and I kind of, does people actually really use those things? Because it wasn't practical to me whatsoever. It was just more about nosing and flavor descriptions. And yeah, can you make one? So I put pen to paper, and I put this one together. You can Google Dr. Don flavor wheel, and it'll come up, and you can download it for free. So it's free of charge. And this is a distillery cheat sheet. Flavor only comes from 3 spots when you're making whiskey. And that starts at the center of the wheel here. It either comes from the grain, the yeast, or the barrel, the wood, right? The second ring of the wheel are the things that I can manipulate as a blender. So During the fermentation process with the yeast, I can change the temperature, I can change the nitrogen level, I can change the grain and water level, I can change the pH, and the yeast will make more or less of those green grass, fruity, floral, soapy notes. So you can influence yeast. That's what brewers do. That's what brewers are doing, and winemakers will do. I can change the grain around and get different flavors. Malty gives you that bready flavor. Rye gives you the spicy flavor. Corn gives you that almost that cauliflower note. Barley gives you that nutty character. Wheat gives you that bready character. Or I can change how you burn a cask, as we discussed. Or we can finish in a cask if we want, like a wine cask or a rum barrel. Or aging gives it distinct flavor. So that's the second ring of the wheel. The third ring of the wheel are the flavor descriptors. So that's your fruity, or that's your lilacs, or your spicy, clove. Cotton candies is more, you can use cotton candy. It's more than relevant. That's a compound called maltol, which leads to the last ring of the wheel. This is the molecular compound that causes that flavor. So if I get a banana note in my whiskey, that's isoamyl acetate, and it came from yeast. If I get a spicy note, that's 4-ethyl glycol, it came in from rye. If I get vanilla, that's how you burn a barrel. It comes in from wood. So this tells you where your flavors and your originates from. This is what I think about at nighttime. I do sleep well.
Well, and so that flavor wheel is literally based on science.
It is absolutely based on science. Yeah.
I found it interesting that you noted that the banana comes from the yeast, and I recall, with the mictors and using a higher barley, what is it, malt, than many of the distillers down here do, and his sense was that that's where you were getting the banana.
Usually, I would probably get into the banana bread with that, because you got the nuts. Barley usually gives you that nutty flavor, very distinctive with the Irish whiskey, or yeah. But probably maybe his yeast strain that he's using, maybe that whatever combination forces it to make more of the banana flavor.
Yeah.
So it could be it forces the yeast to make it. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. It could correlate. It could be a correlation to what he's doing. But I bet you it's beautiful with that banana, and then you get the barley, that nutty. Oh, it'd just be like a muffin or a banana bread. I'm sure it is.
Yeah, that's what you're talking. Banana bread. You're spot on.
See, all these years we just thought we were drinking whiskey, and look at everything that goes into that.
So I mean, relative to that the wheel and all of the manipulations and tastes that you can do to come up with different tastes, do you do a fair amount of that with some of your smaller runs or whatever?
Absolutely.
How is that getting marketed, or is it?
Sometimes I just blend it out. If it's a failure, honestly, I blend it out. The worst case scenario for me, I'm making vodka from it. So that doesn't happen too often, but you can redistill it and strip out all the flavors and make a vodka if that's the worst case scenario for us here.
You make your decision at the high wine level before it ever goes to the barrel?
Yes, I would, but we could also redistill it. I'd be ashamed to age something for 10 years and say, oh, this didn't turn out. At that point, I usually would try to blend it out. But yeah, I mean, we really start out small. That's why we have a small craft distillery inside the big walls, because we do scale up. I really would not do a 300 barrel run of a new grain whiskey or a new style of distillation. I'd start it on a small scale, age it a little bit, and this turning out, maybe I'll scale it up, and if I do see a market for it. So there is reasons why we have small, and we can touch it up or scale up as we go. And that's the mindset. But every year I'm working on something new. Always working on something new.
Well, I think you said 150 products you produce there.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, you get into the different ages, you get into the different barrel types. I've lost track how many SKUs, to be honest with you.
I don't even see how you keep track of that. I mean, honestly, like I don't understand how you would even keep track, and let alone trying to continue to produce at that certain profile for each one of those, because each one of those, I imagine, is very different and unique. And something about it stands out, and your job, I'm guessing, is to continue to replicate that to make sure consumers get what they expect.
We're very good at replicating it. It's finding the market when you're trying to test and learn and do things right. That's the key to that. Is Yeah, we manage though. It's complicated. There's a lot of forecasting going on. I mean, we do it though. I mean, that's why I said I've a lot of people walk through here and said this is one of the most incredible distilleries. I'll add another layer to it. We actually make rum here as well. So add a whole new layer to that. I mean, it's that could be fun, making rum at times too.
Yeah, I had no idea y'all made rum. That's very interesting.
Oh yeah, we got a brand called Lamb's Rum that's very iconic on the Eastern Seaboard. You sell more Lamb's Rum in the Newfoundland Liquor Board than anything else, actually.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I give you a big thumbs up on the Lot 40. It's
Nice,
it's just it is just solidly there as a rye, and it just has no distractions, and that's what I really like about it. It's and that's unusual, frankly. Most of the ryes that we kick around down here and taste have got some other characteristic to them, and this
It's that
one,
pot still. It's
is
that
that
pot
what it
still.
is?
It's
Yeah.
that pot still that makes a world of difference on it. If your audience does want to know a little bit more about making whiskey in Canada, I've just wrote 2 books. COVID did this to me. So I got one called The Keeper of History. So that's the history of the Hiram Walker Distillery and my impact on the industry over the last 25 years. Which is it's a little light reading if you don't know anything about Canadian whiskey and why we are the way we are today. Good book to pick up. And then if you're really into the technical things that we've discussed, I got a second book. It's actually called Blending 101. Yeah, which nobody writes books on blending because usually they're closely guarded secrets within
Yeah,
distilleries.
absolutely.
So I talk about a lot of what we just said is where your flavors originate from, the process of making it, and I actually open up our archived books and where blending has started in Canada. So I got the original recipe of Hiram Walker back in 1886 all the way to how blending is done today. So if you got some real technical people and geeks in the audience that really, it's still
We
pretty
do.
easy reading. You can pick that up. I know you don't have it on, but it's go to jpwiserstour.ca. And you can just order them directly from our company store. They're $20 a piece for the books, but
Oh, that's
yeah.
great. I've got a couple of people in mind right here that would love to read
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, order a bunch at once so you can save on shipping costs. But
Okay,
yeah,
you got it.
jpwiserstour.ca. And if you really want to geek out about, and it applied to any whiskey really in that book, bourbon, but a lot of the same principles will apply.
I think I might have to pick one up for myself.
Yeah.
Christmas gift to me.
Same here.
Yeah.
And how about dispelling or confirming? Now, I'm going to refer now to our group of guys here in Tallahassee, Florida, when we all, 8, 10, 12 years ago, kind of left Scotch and left Canadian Club and Ginger, and we kind of moved to bourbon, and just like a lot of America, we just kind of settled down in this bourbon world, and we're still loving it. And people would say then about Canadian whiskeys, well, they can put other things in there. And they had, as I recall, people saying, they have the ability to put 6 or 7% of something in there that's it's not. What is the scoop on that in a straight deal?
I addressed it in my book. It's a lot of people call it the 909.
Okay.
That seems a very odd number. And I talk about the origins of making whiskey in Canada. Really, back in the day, whiskey, going back to the early 1800s, was a non-aged product. Though you got to understand, Hiram Walker and J.P. Wisers and the original distillers, I'm sure Jim Beam and those guys made their product, put it out the door. You would go to their distillery with a barrel, they'd fill it up for you, you'd take it home and drink it. And one of the problems back in that time period too is people would have barrels that used for many different things. So if a barrel had once fish in it or fur, tea leaves, meat in it, that's what they'd store anything in a barrel at that point. You bring it back to the distillery, you can imagine what your next whiskey is going to taste like. So that's where the burning of the barrels would start, right? So then lo and behold, it gives you a nice, beautiful product. Whiskey up until 1890 around the globe was unaged. Canadian whiskey was the first whiskey category in the world that mandated a minimum aging requirement. The government forced it upon Canadian whiskey producers because there was a direct competition globally on spirit sales. Governments were propped up by the sale of whiskey. People weren't income taxed in Canada or in the US for that matter. So how did the governments make money? It was all through the taxes of spirits. And they were competing against each other. So they're starting to take tariffs and things of there. So they're competing the US market against the Canadian market. And what the Canadian government wanted to do was protect their own. So they wanted to seem like Canadian whiskey was premium. And so they mandated a law, okay, Canadian whiskey now has to be aged for a minimum of 2 years, starting 1890 forward. The Canadian whiskey producers hated it because now they have to buy barrels. They have to buy, now that's how the origins of blending actually started. They have to now buy blending tanks. Excise officers were on site watching every ounce of everything being made, hence probably forced us into blending a little bit. And that's actually where they first discovered the angel share. So Canadian whiskey producers now started saying, I'm losing barrel. Am I getting taxed for it? So that's where the barrel and bond started. And that, Canadian whiskey's all been under bond. We're always under bond. I mean, every ounce that we make. So they realized that they weren't taxed till it was finally got into the bottle. So this developed, and then 1907 was the first time American whiskey started talking about minimum aging requirements in their thing, in the Taft Act. 1915, and the Scotch and Irish whiskey came into line. So Canadian whiskey was novel in the fact it requires a minimum aging law, which is very, very unique. Yeah. Also during that time period, as this kind of blending thing sort of started, Canadian whiskey producers were started to blend, and you could see Hiram Walker blending in rum. He was blending in prune wine. He was blending in Scotch. He was blending in bourbons into what he was making at his Hiram Walker Distillery. So he would make a light base whiskey. That's what consumers wanted. They didn't want the heavier, big, bold style. People that time wanted lighter whiskey. So Hiram Walker would make a light whiskey. Wiser's would make a light whiskey. But they would take and limit themselves to 10%. Of rum or bourbons or wines. So they'd blend 100% light whiskey, 10% of these others, and that's how they would make their blends. Yeah. Moving along. Finally, we get past Prohibition in 1933. We actually laid down our legislation on what Canadian whiskey was defined at, and how they defined it was, okay, you got to be made fermented, it's still in Canada. We realize that you are blending in this 10% of whatever, so we will restrict you. That's just what you can do. Fast forward into the 1990s, they sharpened up our laws even more. If you actually take 100 plus the 10, that equals 110. 10 divided by 110 is 9.09%. Right. So by law, we are not allowed to blend in no more than 9.09% wine or 2-year-old other spirits. Okay, so we can blend in a 40-year-old sherry, or we can blend in cognac, or we can blend in rums, or we can blend in as long as it's been aged for 2 years, or wine. And those tend to be expensive ingredients if we do choose to do that. Sure. So that's the blender. When you talked about 5 or 6%, it's 9.09%. Those are the things we put in there. My supply management guy wants to strangle me when I want to blend in a sherry. You know how much sherry costs? So there's that latitude, and it comes in from history and what Hiram Walker and Wiser's and all these original whiskey producers were doing back in the late 1800s, and that's how that law has evolved and how it is perceived today. So some brands I do it with, some brands I don't. Depends what I'm trying to achieve.
Do we know what we're buying, what you're doing it with, and what you're not doing it with?
Sometimes I disclose it. There's 2 brands you're trying today. We don't do it with, or Pike Creek. There's a Wiser's 15-year. I'm not sure if it's in the US. I do put a little bit of sherry into it. So that's an example of a brand I would do. I released a Wiser's. It was called Union 52 in British Columbia about 4 years ago, and people are scrambling to find any bottle that they can. But I blended in a 52-year-old Scotch at a 4% level.
Unreal.
It is a beautiful, beautiful whiskey. So these are the things you can do. So damn, 52-year-old Scotch into a whiskey, right? So
Yeah.
So those are the things that gives me latitude as a blender. One of my competitors was putting in mezcal, which is interesting, and
Yeah,
aged
that is
mezcal,
very
which
interesting.
I don't know how the sales went on his brand, but it was a rather interesting prototype that he made.
I mean, I can't imagine talking about sherry, but I imagine some people there were not happy with a 52-year-old Scotch. I imagine that was not exactly cheap to
No,
acquire.
no, but it made a fantastic whiskey, which we sold at I think about $70 Canadian at the time, and
Wow.
I think the resale market now, I heard somebody was $400 or $500 for a bottle if they can
Wow.
find one unopened. Uh, uh, that was the nature. But that's the fun part about blending is putting these different combinations together. So you could do lot 40 with a bourbon, right? You really could up to 909 if you wanted to. That would be interesting. I haven't quite done it, but you could do that. Good luck finding excess bourbon nowadays, but
That tends to be a problem here.
yeah,
We struggle with every day because we like to drink and things have
yeah.
changed a lot.
Yeah.
I'm
So,
not
so,
sure. I'm not sure it would go together. Lot 40 and bourbon. I'm not sure how it would go, but it'd be interesting.
but it's certainly enlightening from my standpoint to see this, newbie type talk we were hearing 8, 9, 10 years ago. It's really gives you the ability to do a whole lot of things that we simply can't do.
Blending is beautiful.
Yeah, that's right. There you go. There you go.
Well, so there was a name that kept coming up when you were talking about all that history, which I thought was fascinating, but JP Weisers. And so I'm gonna jump into this because I think it's a perfect segue for the second product
Okay.
we're gonna taste today that you're responsible for. And that, of course, is the JP Weisers 18-year-old blended Canadian whiskey. This the beautiful square bottle we have sitting here. So what can you tell us about this product?
Yeah, so J.P. Weiser, he was an American. He actually lived in Ogdensburg, New York, in the mid 1800s, and he was a farmer. That's what he did for. He raised cattle, and he had over 60,000 head of cattle at one point in history, and he was the first North American to export cattle to Europe. And Ogdensburg, New York is right on the St. Lawrence Seaway. He bought a distillery in Canada right across the river. It probably was a mile away for the purpose of raising cattle. He knew the waste from a distillery grew cattle faster than anything else because it's high in protein value. We strip out the starch to make our alcohol. What's left over is that. And the amazing part, he recognized that in the 1850s. He understood nutrition of a cattle in the 1850s and he wrote textbooks on it. And I got to say, this as a scientist, I find this rather fascinating that, yeah, I mean, I'm getting into just buying a distillery so I could raise my cattle. And lots of people believe Canadian whiskey grew because of Prohibition, and that really isn't the case. Prohibition actually hurt Canadian whiskey category. What grew Canadian whiskey more than anything else was the years 1861 to 1865, which was the American Civil War.
Mhm.
The American North was fighting the American South. Do you think they're going to sell each other whiskey?
Nope.
In fact, they shut down. They shut down the distilleries because the men went to war. They would have used the copper for ammunition and guns and all that thing. They would have wanted their food for food instead of making whiskey. So that left a major void. And whiskey was the most popular drink during the Civil War, and that's where Canadian whiskey grew more than anything else. So J.P. Weiser suddenly realized whiskey was far more profitable than the agriculture business, and that's where the brand started to take off in the 1860s. Likewise, during that time period, a lot of the Canadian whiskeys would have been moonshine style of whiskeys. J.P. Weiser was very an important person in terms of distillation. People did not want that rough, raw spirit anymore. Okay, so that's where your development of column stills started to come into play and rectifying stills. So JP was very renowned. He was finicky dialing in the stills, trying to strip out a lot of those flavors. So going through the 1860s and 1870s and 1880s in Canada, you could see this distillers trying to lighten their spirit by how they rectified it. And they were putting it through charcoal systems, through tray plate systems. And by the time you hit about the 1880s, you now got your rectification stills that you still see today here in Canada. So what they're doing is stripping out a lot of those fusel oils, making light-based whiskey, because that's what they're consuming. So I call light Canadian whiskey what you you guys grew up on as what you think of Canadian whiskey as traditional Canadian whiskey. Very light, and they would blend in little bits of their rye to give it a little bit of character to it. But that's really what Canadian whiskey became. So with Weiser's 18 year, this is our base whiskey. It's been double distilled through 2 column stills. So it removes most of those flavors that I have on my flavor wheel to make that base whiskey. It is 100% corn whiskey. It's been aged over 18 years. And I want you guys to taste this one. This is the taste of angel share, I like to say it. This is the taste of age. This is what happens in a barrel after 18 years of aging. In climates like ours, you're getting a lot of expansion and contraction of the barrel because of the heating and cooling cycles. So you get a lot of air ingressing in between the 32 staves that go around a barrel. When air touches ethanol, it turns it into a compound called ethyl acetate. And it just keeps going and going and going and going and going in time. That's the terroir to whiskey, if you want to call it a terroir, okay? We make 10 parts per million of ethyl acetate on our climatic conditions here. We don't temperature control our warehouses. We actually get down, or the whiskey in the barrel will get down into the 20s in the winter. And in the summer, it'll get probably about 82 to 84, the liquid. So that's how much expansion contraction. We lose 3% a year to evaporation loss. We make 10 parts per million of ethyl acetate. This is what you're smelling here. Because we started out with a light spirit, this is what's happening in the barrel. This is why I'm calling this as a taste of angel share. You'll get it in your highly aged bourbons. Gets covered up with the grain flavors because you're only single column distilling a bourbon, right? Maybe you got a doubler, but you're single column distilling it. Same with Scotch. You get buried under the peat, but this will be in behind it. This character is to the forefront. Memorize it.
You're saying you started out with a light spirit. What do you mean when you say that?
Closest thing I could tell you is a vodka. Very close to vodka. It's a little dirtier than vodka, but very similar to vodka is that light spirit. That's that light grain whiskey. We call it base whiskey here. This is what aging does in a barrel, and you get that distinctive green apple flavor in the whiskey.
Yeah, that was what I was gonna say. Almost like I definitely get like I would consider almost like a caramel type candy flavor, but a lot of that green apple comes out to me on this one.
That's the taste of age. So next time you have a highly aged bourbon, look for this flavor. It'll be buried under the grain flavor, but it's there. Next time you have a highly aged Scotch, look for this flavor. It's not buried under the peat a little bit, but this is the flavor. This is what happens in a barrel. That's the interaction in the barrel. Is this flavor?
Well, I have a good friend, and this is his go-to. This is his favorite, and I can absolutely see why and
it's smooth. It's very smooth.
This.
Very smooth, easy drinking.
It's just a comfortable sit down and have a nice drink of whiskey type of a drink.
You don't want an overpowerful whiskey.
Yeah.
Just on neat, just sitting down after dinner or something like that. This whiskey, I mean, is just a nice go-to whiskey. I mean, it's
100%.
Yeah, nothing unusual about it.
That out of both of these pours, and what I'm most impressed with is the lack of distractions in either. I mean, it's just not something you got to give a hell of a lot of thought about. It's just solid, what it's meant to be type of whiskey.
Yeah, and these are 2 polar whiskeys. One's lighter and one's heavy, big rye whiskey, and then you can imagine blending. It's anywhere in between those, right?
Yeah.
Well, what's crazy to me is looking at this JP Weiser's bottle. I mean, it's got an 18-year age statement on it. And, I'm in Tallahassee, and Florida is kind of known for being, shall we say, not the best when it comes to distribution. We don't get things, particularly in North Florida. But I was able to find this, and they had a few bottles of it. It's an 18-year-old whiskey, and I think this was $60 US, which I only bring this up because when was the last time you saw an 18-year-old bourbon that was like not damn near $1,000?
Yeah,
I mean, that's kind of what blew me away. Oh, look what you just opened, huh?
Yeah, you opened the original one. You're curious now.
I am curious. So how old is that guy that we were showing you there? That's one. That's
Well-
one I picked up off the shelf with a fellow named Steve Lukanic here in Tallahassee. And
I'm looking at bottles probably from anywhere between probably about 1985 to about 1990,
really,
somewhere in that range. Now that doesn't mean the liquor in the bottle is that old,
yeah.
but that's probably when that was bottled. And that, like I said, this recipe hasn't changed in 60 years. So I'd be very curious if you think it tastes the same. Or I'd love to have it taste side by side with you guys, but I don't have that bottle in particular.
We'll absolutely send you a sample. I can't.
I'll take your word for it. You guys know whiskey very well, but it should taste very similar, right? It really hasn't changed a whole heck of a lot, I hope.
You know, well, just to clarify for anyone listening that might not be watching this, John happened to have a bottle of Weiser's very old blended Canadian whiskey, an 18-year-old, same thing we just opened, but as Dr. Don said, this one was significantly older. He had stored in the offers for a good 20 plus years, and he happened to just crack that open. He didn't want to sell it on the secondary market. He wanted to drink it. So.
I have enough money. I don't have enough whiskey.
No, it's it's really cool tasting these side by side because you're talking significant, potentially maybe almost 3 decades apart.
Yep.
And they are, to me, so similar.
They really are. I'm getting a little bit more, and there's probably something, you can tell us if it is or not, to the fact that something sits on the shelf for 20, 30 years longer than the other one. It's going to develop some different taste, and I'm getting a little bit more depth to the older one.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there
I
may
agree
be.
with
Taste
it
is
could-
on spot on. Yeah.
Yeah, it could be just our barrel inventory back in the 80s. Maybe there was a little bit of a newer inventory. In Canadian whiskey, we can reuse the barrels over and over again. So you might be tasting the nuances of the whole barrel quality as a whole for us. Yeah, that's probably what you're picking up. Would be my guess. You're probably getting a little more vanilla, caramel, toffee notes to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
But the taste profile is on spot on. Yeah.
You could tell they're from the same whiskey family.
Yes, you can.
Which
Yeah.
again, to me, is just kind of amazing because you think, I mean, again, 30 plus years apart, completely different people probably involved in the distillation and the blending, and involved in every part of the process. But yet, look how close things can be when you develop your processes and you follow them and you adhere to them and you maintain them throughout the years. Look what you can do.
Good point.
In terms of just maintaining what you want your product to be. And
Great point.
that blows me away as someone that just likes to drink whiskey and who doesn't make it. But I don't know, wrapping my head around the idea of like, we made that 40 years ago. Tastes a lot like what we're making today. That's crazy.
It's mind-boggling.
It is.
Well, you got grains, where they're coming from, and who's growing them, farmers, the whole chain going up.
Oh yeah.
Changes over time like that.
Yeah.
Tell me about it.
Yeah, you got to deal with that every year, I guess, don't you?
Yeah.
Every
absolutely.
day.
Yeah. Well,
Hey,
the number one quality check to us is our sensory panel. I mean, we got a great team of people here. My job is to set the standard to what that's about. We got a really robust system here on nosing whiskeys and tasting whiskeys and setting standards, and we're very regimented about it. Can't say enough. That's the most important test in a distillery, maybe other than measuring the alcohol itself, but sensory is number one for sure.
Is the company a public company as we know it? Or what's the
Yep.
story on the company?
Yep. So with the company, we got kind of dual owners. So in Canada, it's Corby. It's on the Toronto Stock Exchange. So Corby is the owner of these brands and ultimately owns the majority shares inside of Corby is Pernod Ricard. So we are the larger company of Pernod Ricard is the owner of the brand. So a good company to work for. I must say they kind of leave you alone, at least from a scientific point of view and product development point of view. They expect you to know your regional markets and what people are looking for. So it's not dictated from Europe or anything like, oh, you must make this. It's kind of left up to the master blenders and the master distillers in our company that to locally what's going on. So that's why I said the most important job for a master blender is to understand your consumer, right? Understand the consumer, what they're looking for.
Yep. How much of your brands are sold in the U.S. and or overseas?
For Wiser's family of products, which is our largest brand, it's about a 750,000 case brand. So it's significant size in Canada. The US, we're probably 50, 60,000 cases, but Wiser's is growing very quickly in the US right now, as is with the Lot 40 at Pike Creek. I know we didn't taste the Pike Creek today, but those are your three quickly growing brands in the US. Overseas, we are picking up pace. Wiser's actually does very well in all. It sounds unusual, but in Sweden, it does very, very well in Sweden, and we're doing well with Pike Creek in France and Germany as well, and then we're just recently getting launched into the UK and everything else. So it's taken a lot of effort, but I mean, we're focusing in on the EU, and I know we have actually some aspirations in Australia this year as well. So probably if it wasn't for COVID, I'd be probably flying all over the world right now to introducing and launching some of our brands globally. But things are on the momentum. I don't know if there's a resurgence of Canadian whiskey, their curiosity about it. Once you get with groups like you guys, they said, wow, this is different. We didn't realize this was what Canadian whiskey was. And that's what I hope I kind of brought to the table for you guys today. Is
you absolutely did. And from my own personal standpoint, I'm going to go back to Caribou coming in with that first single barrel that I was tasting coming out, and I'm saying, hey man, this is a coup for Canadian brands. But then we're seeing some of these great ryes coming out of Canada, and I think Canada's sort of flag on the hill here in the States with bourbon drinkers in particular, with the ryes that you guys are sending down here. And then there's the market for these wines, which is there, and it's going to always be there, because there's the guy I know who is a hunting dog trainer, man. That's what he wants to come home to after a day in the plantation. So I think you guys are planting your flag with damn good whiskey, and that's making a big difference.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think our biggest struggle, I think, with Canadians is we've kept our good stuff to Canada. We're now starting to spill into the US. So we get some really cool expressions and cast strength releases and things of that nature. They're starting to trickle down to the US because we're realizing that there's some popularity. These signature series blends, you're starting to see some popularity in it. So I anticipate the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to see a little bit of resurgence and a little bit of a different taste profile than the traditional Canadian whiskey. I know our competitors keep me on my toes, and they're making great stuff. But the problem with the issue with Canadians is that we really don't get out there and tell our story very well. And I really appreciate the opportunity for you to get me on air with you guys, or on the podcast here, to tell our story, because I think that's what whiskey is, storytelling, right? It's part of it.
And
right?
you tell it so well. I mean, I don't know if you've done them, but you should be doing TED Talks and everything else, and you talk about your classes. Man, you tell this story better than anybody I've spoken with.
I agree.
Amazing.
Yeah, we were so excited to be able to snag an hour of your time, because I mean, not just your the technical knowledge that you've acquired, but the historical knowledge you've learned over the years, and I think that culminates in just
thank you,
the most well-rounded knowledge of whiskey that we've had the experience to hear. Because there's so much that goes into these products and the names on these labels that I feel like most people just don't understand. And I think if they're given the opportunity, they want to. that's why we do this, because we just want to learn. We don't have the knowledge, but we're certainly open to trying to learn as much as we can in the time we have. And really can't thank you enough, Dr. Don. This was such an enlightening experience for us.
Yeah, well, I would say, just to close, is just as a reminder, if you want to learn a lot more about whiskey, you can follow me on Twitter, on Instagram, or LinkedIn at CDN Whiskey Doc. That's whiskey without an E. Yeah, Canadian Whisky Doc, CDN Whiskey Doc. It's whiskey without an E. Instagram, Twitter, or LinkedIn. I would also encourage you to look at that flavor wheel. Just like I said, Google Dr. Don Livermore and flavor wheel. It's there for free. And if you really want a deep dive, you can, again, like I said, my books, you can go to jpwiserstour.ca, jpwiserstour.ca. And that's just our company store, and it's the keeper of history and blending 101. And they won't be a disappointment to any whiskey lover in terms of whiskey knowledge, to let you know that. So I appreciate you guys for having me, and let me have a little bit of a voice as a Canadian whiskey producer.
Well, we can't thank you enough. And anyone listening, I'll put that link up on this post. So if you're listening to this, just go ahead and click on that. It'll take you right there. It'll save you a little bit of time. And, just keep following Dr. Don. And I think you're going to be excited about what you see him doing. And I know I follow you, and I see all the stuff you got going on. It's a lot of fun. And maybe we can get into one of those classes at some point.
You need to come on down to Florida and pay a visit, then you can write off the trip.
It's getting colder here. I got to come down and visit you guys.
Come on down, man.
All right, Dr. Don. Well, thank you so much for your time. And thank you for this wonderful whiskey. And hopefully we'll talk to you again soon.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Cheers.
Cheers.